Thanks. So, okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Peter Kraut, the rate setting manager at MaineCare, and we are here, as you all know, to kick off the rebasing process pursuant to LD 1787, which passed the legislature this session. As you all know, other than MEI and changes in scope, FQHC rates in Maine have been basically unchanged since BIPA was enacted 20 years ago. And you all know that the nature of primary care has changed tremendously since then, as has or have FQHC's cost structures. So this rebasing is certainly a long time coming, and we are very, very excited to be partnering with you on it. We have retained Guidehouse, a national consulting firm that has done FQHC work in other states, in addition to a lot of other healthcare work with other state Medicaid programs. We're really excited about having them as a partner. And we really do view this process that we're going to be kicking off today as a partnership with you, the FQHCs, and with MPCA. As you all know, per the statute, the rebasing will be effective this coming March 1st. So we've got October, November, December. So we've got 5 months. We're actually getting a pretty decent start on this. It's not too late, you know, and we've built in a good timeline to allow you all to work with Guidehouse through this process. And so the purpose of today's meeting is Guidehouse is going to walk everyone through what this process is going to look like, to take your questions, to hear your ideas, so that we can initiate this process of working together over the coming months on the rebasing. I'm a little bit torn on whether we should take the time to introduce everybody on the call. We've got 35 people, so full introductions would probably burn through valuable time. I guess I could do a quick, just letting you know on the MaineCare side who we've got, and then Darcy, if you wanted to walk through, you know, sort of the highlights of who you've got on your side, and then Guidehouse would do their introductions and launch right in. Darcy, does that sound like a reasonable use of time?
It does. Can you hear me? I'm just checking my settings here.
Great. Loud and clear.
Happy to do it.
Okay. So on our end, as I mentioned, I'm the rate setting manager at MaineCare, Peter Kraut. Used to work at MPCA a very long time ago. Darcy and I used to share an office, in fact. And then I'm joined by others from the rate setting team. And a lot of you probably recognize Shannon Beggs. She is the provider relations specialist who covers FQHCs. Grace Williams is a who has worked closely with a number of you on your changes in scope. I've got Brian Lumbra and Jessica Levesque, who are project managers. Mandy Lee is a indispensable member of our team, helping us stay organized on everything. And then, of course, we've also got David Jorgensen, who is the Director of Data Analytics and Rate Setting, who I report to. Darcy, please go ahead and introduce your side.
Sure. So if my counting is right, we've got roughly 14 FQHCs represented in the call today, so over half. I understand that this will be recorded, so we'll make sure that the rest of the health centers, if they don't log on, we'll get the same information. And then we've got about 6 staff, which essentially make up our policy team. And they are the folks that were instrumental in helping to get 1787 crafted and basically through the finish line. And then you'll see Craig Hostetler is on with us. He's someone that we've been working with around our rates and specifically APM development, but also Craig was really helpful in setting the baseline for this rebasing work, in part because that is so instrumental to moving forward with VBP related stuff. So that's essentially who we've got on, roughly about 6 staff, and then other majority health centers. Looks like most of the health centers sent 1 representative.
Great. It is really great to see so many people on the call. And as you mentioned, Darcy, yeah, we are recording it so that, and we'll be posting it to our website so that anybody who missed it can watch. But also just to make the point that throughout this process, this is really going to be sort of an open door, two-way communication where we know that a lot of the FQHCs are going to have questions about how to fill out, the supplemental cost report that Guidehouse will be explaining. And so, the lines are always open for questions and interaction throughout the coming months, so that even if someone, isn't making it to the meeting to ask any questions that they might have, there will be ample opportunity for questions and back and forth throughout the process. So with that said, I will hand it over to Guidehouse to do their own introductions and to launch into the presentation.
Great. Thanks, Peter. We'll have Holly put up our presentation. Good morning, everyone. Next slide. So my name is David Garbarino. I'm the overall engagement leader for this piece of work. We're here to help MaineCare and you develop the next set of FQHC rates. Let's briefly go through our agenda, what we want to accomplish, and then we'll introduce the team. So as I mentioned, we'll introduce the team. We'll talk about our project goals, give you a little bit of background for those of you who aren't familiar, many of you probably are, of the Benefit Protection and Improvement Act, which is BIPA, the act that governs FQHC rate setting. Talk a little bit about the updated payment methodology, how the rate setting process is going to go, our timeline, which, as Peter laid out for you, is, while it's certainly sufficient, we have to work in a measured and deliberate process. Talk about what a key element of this rate setting, which is going to be our deployment of a supplemental cost report to collect additional information, the data involved there, and then really open it up to a discussion, because we really do want to hear from you. Before we jump into the introduction, just a little bit, briefly about Guidehouse. As Peter said, we are a national consulting firm, actually international consulting firm, with a lot of experience with FQHCs. And that having been said, however, we're not here to sort of say this is how it's going to be. This is really a collaborative process. It's, we're going to make every effort to help you convey the information about how you treat your patients to the state and incorporate that into an updated set of rates. So we're partnering. It's really a 3-way partnership. So next slide, Holly. Okay, so in terms of introduction, we just heard, thank you very much, from the FQHC folks. Thank you, Darcy, for introducing who you have there, and Peter as well for introducing your team. I'll just walk through who we have on the call today. So at the top, we have Tamara Porter, who is the partner who is overseeing this engagement. Then myself, David Garbarino, as I said, I am the engagement director for this project. And then also on the call, we have Holly McDonald, Josh Mim, and Sean Clare, who are all experienced individuals working with this provider type. Next slide. So in a moment, I'm going to actually ask Holly to walk through what the project goals are here. But at the end of the slide, you will see, as part of our discussion, I've actually put up my email. So as Peter said, this is a very back and forth process. So during the course of either following this call or any subsequent piece of information, we're here to hear from you. And if you have questions, we're putting our email up, and you can reach out to me. and we will get back to you as promptly as we can. So Holly, if you want to start walking through, that'd be great.
Awesome. Thank you, David. So we wanted to start by going through the project goals, and you've heard a little bit about this already. But we're coming together to develop updated cost-based rates for the Maine FQHCs. And as part of that, we really need to determine what services should be included in the T1115 and what should be reimbursed separately. And as part of that, it's really that the facilities have gone through scope of changes, scope requests, but we recognize that how FQHCs deliver services has changed over the years. So we want to understand what services you're delivering and that those costs are accurately reflected in the rate. As part of this whole process, it's also going to be a rebasing. So we're going to be determining the cost of providing services during the updated fiscal years of 2019 and 2020. And then adjust those for any changes in scope that have happened since those fiscal years, as well as inflating to the current rate period. And all of those pieces will be discussed as part of this call and throughout the process. And so just kind of keep that in mind that we are rebasing to, a couple years ago, but that we will be helping you inform us of what other changes have happened and make sure those are reflected in the rate. And so the primary goal of all of this is to develop a partnership and to work with you, the FQHCs, to provide that necessary information to achieve the top line goal of making sure you have an updated rate. And we're starting about that today, as we said, to allow an opportunity to hear from the FQHC providers. As we go through this presentation, you'll see we don't have too many slides. We wanted to keep it pretty compact in order to allow a lot of time at the end to really have a great conversation. So please let us know if you have any questions and we will get into it. So we're going to start with an overview of the Benefit Improvement and Protection Act, which is BIPA. So FQHC rate setting is unique in Medicaid in that it is largely governed by federal regulation. There is some wiggle room within those regulations, but the rate setting process itself is very well established. And so Congress in 2000 wanted to ensure that FQHCs were covering their costs with Medicaid rates. And so they passed this legislation to ensure a cost-based minimum all-inclusive bundled payment rate, which was the PPS, which is the Prospective Payment System. And it was based on 100% of facilities' average cost per encounter during state fiscal years 1999 and 2000. And as Peter said earlier, you've been receiving those annual rates for inflation based on the MEI and changes in the scope of services provided to patients. Under BIPA, there's also a regulation that allows states to reimburse FQHCs using an alternative payment methodology, or an APM, with CMS approval. And that's what this process will include. We're actually going to be moving into developing that alternative payment method, and you'll also have the option of the PPS, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the next slide. But I wanted to pause and see if anybody had any questions about the BIPA legislation and how it relates to this process. Nope, perfect. Okay. So here you'll see the two different payment methodologies. So as we mentioned before, we have the PPS, which is that baseline rate based on fiscal years 1999 and 2000. And now we're going to be moving into the alternative payment methodology, which there's no set way that it has to be, but based on the legislative directive that Maine has, it's going to be a baseline rate based on the average facility costs during fiscal years 1999 and 2000. It will be, like we said before, adjusted annually for inflation, and there'll still be changes in scope of services provided to patients. This will help to hopefully encompass all of those new service lines and changes to delivery that have happened since your rate was set back in 2000. There are two important things to understand about the APM. APM rates must be equal or greater than the PPS reimbursement rate every year. So Maine will continue to update the PPS as a baseline rate, and all the facilities will know that if they choose to accept the APM, that rate will be at least equal or greater than their PPS. As well, the other option is that FQHCs always have the option of reimbursement under the PPS or the APM. By participating in this process, you're not committing yourself to taking that APM rate. Under federal regulation, there's always the option of either rate. Any questions here? Perfect. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the rate setting process. As we engage in this process, the FQHCs will be asked to report the cost involved with rendering services via a supplemental cost report. And we are calling it a supplemental cost report, and we'll get into that a little bit in a minute. We're trying to leverage the cost that you've already provided through the CMS process, and we want to make this the least administratively burdensome on the facilities as possible. We understand that cost reporting processes are not always the most fun to go through, but we are trying and make it, as we said, a partnership and as the least administratively burdensome as possible. So the supplemental FQHC cost report was designed to augment the CMS FQHC 224/2014 form, which all the facilities should be aware of. And there's a couple things that go into this. We are going to request a minimum data set that every FQHC should be able to report on. And this is important because while each facility gets an individual rate, the rate methodology will be the same for all facilities. So one of the things that we want to make sure is that all facilities can report the data that is requested in a way that everybody's confident in the quality of the data and that it is comprehensive and covers all the costs that the FQHCs have incurred. The next important point is that participation is necessary to establish a new APM rate. We can't help establish a rate if the facilities don't submit a cost report. That is necessary to establish the APM. The next point is that the costs that are reported should be supported with documentation of provider financials. And what this means is that we're going to be requesting audited financials from the facilities to compare to the supplemental cost reports to ensure that they have been completed to the utmost, to the highest level of completeness. And this is really to help us make sure that, a zero hasn't been missed. So if you have in one service line $1 million of cost and you've reported $100,000 of cost because that one zero has been missed, we want to make sure that we're capturing that and that the cost that we're looking at accurately reflect the actual cost of delivering services, so that that updated APM rate is an actual, reflection of the facility's costs. So that's really what we'll be doing with those audited financials. And if facilities have questions about that, we're happy to work with them. We know sometimes that can be a touchy point for facilities. So, please, throughout this process, let us know if you have any questions about that. And as we kind of talked about before, all submissions of the cost reports will be reviewed to ensure costs are accurately captured. Again, this is just very important to make sure that the rates that are calculated accurately reflect the costs that the facilities have in delivering those services. Any questions about this piece? No. Great. So we're going to get into the timeline. So the supplemental cost report timeline includes review, release, administration, and completion, which spans over several months. And we'll walk through the timeline. The important thing to note is that FQHCs will have 4 weeks after release of the cost report to complete the cost report. And we will be providing technical assistance throughout that process if FQHCs have any questions as they work to complete that cost report. So currently we're at the kickoff here at 1017 within the green box. The next step is over the next week or so, we will work to incorporate any feedback received from the FQHCs and to finalize that cost report. We'll be walking you through a draft of the cost report, and we want the FQHCs to understand that that cost report has not been finalized because we haven't talked to you. We don't want to release something that we haven't reviewed with you and make sure it incorporates all the important elements. The next piece is in late October, we will release that cost report and hold a provider training. And again, this is where we want some feedback from the FQHCs of what would be the most helpful when it comes to that. We've held live trainings, we've released webinars that have been recorded. Really the feedback we receive today will help us to determine what will be the most helpful in that process. Once the cost report has been released, providers will have 4 weeks after release to complete it before we ask that you submit it. You're welcome to submit it early if you get it done. That's not usually the case, but we will take it and start reviewing it. As those cost reports start rolling in, what we will do is we'll start reviewing them for completeness and make sure that everything that we need to calculate the rate is included in the cost report. We'll also be comparing it against those audited financials to, as I said, make sure that costs have been recorded accurately and that the numbers are making sense. You know, it's not a one-to-one comparison. If it was, we'd just take those audited financials and use them, but they do help provide us some baseline numbers to look and make sure that everything is passing the sniff test and that the numbers in there should be accurately reflecting the cost of delivering services. Once we have confirmed all of the data and we have a set of data to work on with, we will start sending, or actually, sorry, I skipped a step. We will send out revision requests if we review the cost report and realize that there's information missing. So once you've submitted your cost report, please be on the lookout for any requests from us that are questions about cost reported so that we can just make sure that we can confirm that data and finalize it. Once the data is finalized, we will start calculating the APM rates. An important thing to understand here is, as we said before, participation is necessary for us to calculate an APM rate. However, we're not going to be slowing down the process and waiting for facilities that have not submitted a cost report to calculate everybody's rate. This is not a group rate, it is an individual rate. So we will be able to calculate facilities' FQHC rates if we have received your cost report. So don't worry that this whole process is going to be delayed because one facility hasn't submitted their cost report. Having said that, we do need to get them in, so it's not like you have extra time. We wanted to make sure people understood that this is an individually calculated rate, and so we don't need every single cost report. We're not gonna, this will not be going into June of next year. The goal is to get this completed on time to make sure the facilities understand what their rate is so that they can budget for the coming up calendar year, and that their rate is in the system so that you can be paid on time. Any questions about the timeline? Okay, we'll keep going. So here's the supplemental cost report, and I am going to hand this over to my colleague Sean to go ahead and give you a little bit more information about this piece.
Thank you, Holly, and good morning, everybody. So in a moment, we're going to open up and take a look at the draft itself. But before we do that, let's take a look over what we're going to be looking at. So we've got 5 sections in the cost report itself. The first is the getting to know you page, provider and contact information. This is just information about your organization, where you are, in some very important things like your NPI and identification numbers, your tax ID, things like that. But that's going to help us tie out to your 224s. Second tab, and this is the heavy lift of all of them, is the gross charges. We're going to be looking to get a breakdown of your charges and volume by your underlying procedure codes. So as we talked about, if there are carve-out needs or just getting a hold of which services you're providing now as opposed to back in 2000. Beyond that, we have 3 tabs: dental, behavioral health, and other Medicare excluded services. And these are subsections really of the gross charges tab. We're going to ask a few questions about each of these services to get a better idea of what you're providing, how you're providing it. Next slide, Holly. And as far as data, there's some data that we definitely need to have here. Provider information, provider numbers for all your locations and your contact information. This is going to help with the back and forth process and partnering with you, making sure all this information is as accurate as possible to get you the best rate possible. And then procedure code level detail. As you're all aware, you bill under the 1015, but we're actually going to be asking about the procedure codes that you provide under the 1015 as well, the gross charges, the volume of those charges, and then we're going to be tying that back to your CMS cost reports. and making sure those match up. And we have some other questions about things, whether or not they were included in your cost reports as well.
One quick thing, Sean, I just want to point out, we're asking you all to provide information on your entire book of business, but not separately. In other words, we're aware that there's approximately 20 sort of individual FQHCs, but there's as many as 70 individual sites. We're not looking for detail at the site level. It's really at that 20 level, the same level that you file your cost report. So this might be a little bit misleading, but our intent is really to align with the 224 cost report and not at the individual site location, just in case that came across here.
Yeah, and actually, Holly, if I can snag the screen here. We can look at the supplemental template. So again, caveating that this is a draft version, we want to hear from you. Are we missing anything? Is anything unclear before we send this out? And we will be providing training for this as well. But there will be an instructions page. Those instructions are still draft, but we will be making sure those are as clear as possible, and again, providing some training. But as David was saying, looking at the provider information page, we're going to be asking, when are you actually submitting this? But your individual facility NPI numbers, so we have the information for each facility, but then your general tax identification numbers, so we can pool that all together within the same organization. We don't need facility by facility financials, just for the organization as a whole. We'll also be asking about your reporting period. Not everybody is aligned with the same fiscal year, so we want to make sure that as we deal with trending and inflation, that we have the appropriate periods to get that correct. The gross charges tab is going to be the bulk of what you need to do for this cost report. We've got some of the procedure codes, and we will be adding to this list before the cost report goes out, of what is charged under FQHCs. So you've got the T1015 line, which should have your total gross charges, but then these other line item procedure codes that you bill under the 1015, we'd like to get the gross charges and volume of those underlying codes as well, which of course will be a subset of the total gross charges. The category is a drop down. It's to make sure that we can pull in things like dental, behavioral health, and the other Medicare excluded
Sean?
items. Yes.
Sean, this is Peter. I just want to make a correction. What you have on line 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, those are not billed under the T1015. Those are items that are listed in the Chapter 3 and that are billed separately from the 1015 and are paid separately from the 1015. Things that we build that would be billed under the T1015 and pay at zero are basically anything else, which we'll talk about later. But I just wanted to be very specific that those items that you just showed are the ones that are paid separately from the T1015.
Yeah, and we certainly have some placeholders in here. This is all going to be updated prior to things being sent out. But thank you, David. I definitely appreciate, not David, Peter, appreciate you. It's down in the South. All the New England accents sound so similar. So yeah, but in addition to that, like these codes, there is a space for you to add additional codes that you bill under T1015, but that we didn't include in the top section of the pre-filled codes. So we want to make sure we capture any costs that would be billed under T1015, and we're not missing anything because we want your complete costs. Also included in that, we're asking, were your totals included in the appropriate cost report? In the case that for some reason that total was not included in the cost report, we want to know that when we go to tie things out to the 224s.
This is Sharon Stanley. Can I ask a question?
By all means, Sharon.
So if you scroll down a little bit on that page, you asked for all the codes that are not listed above. So are you talking about every E&M code, every behavioral health code, every screening code? It's going to be a lot of codes.
Yes, and our goal is to have as many of those filled out for you as possible.
Okay.
And this is Craig. I wanted to clarify a couple basic things. I've seen a couple different baseline years floating around. 2020 is on this cost report. Obviously, that's during COVID, and so I'm wondering, is there room to talk about what year seems to be the most appropriate year to capture costs? So that's one question. The other question is, I saw earlier about an APM and change in scope since 1999 and 2000. I'm assuming that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the most recent cost report, and that's what we're going to be working off of, not trying to catch up on a change in scope basis, because the recent cost report is a rebasing methodology.
So I can take those, Craig. So the answer to both of your questions is yes. So in terms of year, in other words, and this is actually a very important point, to be perfectly honest, and this applies to sort of all provider types within Maine and elsewhere, is that the last several years have been sort of in some ways unprecedented, right? I mean, the last year that was sort of, we'll call a steady state, would have been 2019. Then of course you had 20, 21, and now we're into 22. That's having been said, however, we're aware that a number of the FQHCs have year ends on different periods. Some have a March year end, some have June, September, or a calendar year. So that's going to be a very important piece, because our goal, and we very much want to have that discussion when we following our formal presentation here today, is our goal is to have the most current information that is reflective of your services, right? And and that's why we're not pinning it down today, because that is a very important thing, and we want to hear from you about that. As Holly said during her portion, we discussed that the goal is to get an accurate cost per visit, and then of course that's just multiplied by your visits. However, what we want to hear about is what has been your experience and in the last several years, and what would you want us to collect? Because to be consistent, we will be collecting the same years for everybody, right? In other words, the methodology has to be standardized, but we just want to hear from you. And then also, yes, there was a bit of a typo in one of the earlier slides, or a reference. It's actually not a typo. Is we are talking about changes in scope since the last cost report, right? In other words, because we're presuming that when we settled on the cost report year, that's going to be complete in terms of everything you did. We also know that there's a process with the state that you ask for permission and they grant, saying we now do this, and the state said great, we'll now pay for that, and we have access to that information as well. But again, in the interest of being as complete as possible, that's why we're doing this supplemental cost report. And there's one more thing I wanted to point out about this supplemental cost report that you will see, that for those of you who are familiar with the Medicare 224, is the Medicare 224, while it does collect charge and cost information, it's really at the rev code level, in other words, your department level, as opposed to the service line level. But our objective, quite frankly, in addition to setting that overall rate, is to try to identify the costs of these services. Because one of the things that we think is very important is to define what is grouped into the T1015, as it is today, and what is reimbursed separately. I mean, today, as Peter corrected us, there's the top line T105, and then a series of additional codes that you are paid for separately. But to the extent we want to take a hard look at what should be grouped in that T1015 and what should be separate. It helps us to know, to orient at the service line level. And that's really, you'll see the orientation of this cost report is sort of more horizontal rather than vertical, the way the 224 is, if that makes sense. But ultimately the goal is to be able to tie the bottom line back. So it just gives us an additional insight and view into, your operation. I hope, Craig, that answers your question.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And just another thing for consideration is, if we're talking about costs and what cost report year to use, obviously the current environment with the the difficulty in attracting staff and the way wages have gone up significantly in the
Yes.
past year or so, that will be an important consideration as well.
It definitely will. And I can just tell you from our experience, both with FQHCs in other states and quite frankly, across the board from all provider types, there has, as I mentioned a moment ago, we are sort of in somewhat of an unprecedented time, both in terms of the availability of labor and then the cost that labor is to you. So we're going to want to capture that. But I'll be perfectly honest, because we're trying to be transparent. Part of our challenge is to say, what is the cost today, and then what will be that cost tomorrow during the rate year? Because I'm sure, as you're well aware, we've been on this sort of steady upward climb in the hourly rate of individuals, but realistically, we don't think it's going to continue at that steady rate. The question is, what will that rate be? Because these rates are going to be effective 3/1 of 23. And then they'll be good for a year or two on, with inflation. So, this is, as rate setters, we find this a challenge, but it's a challenge that we believe not only are we up to, but we think by partnering with you, we can get the right number.
And one thing I would add to that, Craig, Sharon, and David, is the statute requires, I'm looking at it right now, and it says, let's see, the cost of providing services must be the average of reasonable cost incurred in the center's fiscal years ending in 2018 and 2019, and then adjusted for any change in scope adjustment since then, and for inflation since then. So we don't have leeway to use anything other than those 2018, 2019 cost reports. And so that makes me wonder if what we've got in cell G10, it seems to me it needs to be changed to 28 and 2019, that it then wraps around, those 224s. Now, to your point, Craig, about the change in the labor market and just inflation in general since then. Yes, we'd need to start with those 2018, 2019, but then we'd apply inflation. And we all know that real inflation since then has far outstripped CMS MEI. But because we're doing an APM, in the BIPA sense of the word, we would not be constrained to using the MEI for that inflationary adjustment, and can look into what might be a more reasonable inflation index to get us from those 2018, 2019 costs to the present. And then to David's point, so once we've got the costs, then the next question is going to be, well, what's the appropriate thing to use for utilization?
Peter,
and yep.
This is Sharon. I think that the statute actually says that we need to use the MaineCare FQHC market basket, which is not the MEI. It's different.
Okay.
But I do know that health centers are concerned that inflation amount is not going to cover the increased costs of staff.
Okay. So, yeah, and I'm seeing that too. Yep, you guys put in the market basket. So yeah, we've got to do what the statute says. So
Peter, sorry, Peter, this is Darcy, but to the point you were just making about the flexibility, do you have the sense that we could apply first the market basket and then really look at some other additional inflationary index given the really crazy circumstances that health centers are facing right now, especially relative to workforce?
let's look into it. All I can say right now is we've got to comply with the statute, on the state side. And obviously our SPA is going to have to reflect what it is we're doing, which has to be according to the state statute. But then the question of, you know, from the SPA perspective, and SPA means state plan amendment for those of you who don't speak Medicaid, that we need to file with CMS a state plan amendment, you know, to get their approval of what we do. Because we're doing an APM going forward, we will have that flexibility to use something different than the MEI. But that's going forward because the state statute says that we've got to use the FQHC market basket percentage to get from 2018-19 to present. I mean, we've got to do that. And so I'm just thinking, so that would, I mean, yeah, there might, we need to dig into the weeds and look at what's possible within all of that language.
Thank you.
So that's all I had to add, just about, you know, just the importance of adhering to the statute and the fact that it says that we've got to use those 2018, 2019 cost reports. Oh, and then the other thing is yeah, I mean, ultimately, once we've got the cost, you know, we got to divide it by the projected utilization. And yeah, COVID, the interaction of a downturn from COVID and then increases, you know, from Medicaid expansion has made it difficult to predict the future. But for all of you who have done changes in scope over the past few years, you know that we've developed an approach to, you know, trying to predict a coming year of utilization given those two contradictory forces. But through this process, you know, we will figure out with you and with Guidehouse, you know, what is the best way to predict coming utilization for this purpose.
I have one other question, if I could ask, of Guidehouse, and just wondering why there's going to be a separate tab for dental and behavioral health, because our FQHCs are reimbursed the same rate for all of their services.
I can answer that question. I mean, it's really twofold, and as I'm sure you're aware, the state was in receipt of a letter from the FQHCs in regard to their reimbursement for dental services, and so we thought it important to capture that information a little bit more specifically. I mean, as Sean pointed out, the dental tab is a subset of the total tab, and because FQHCs are also a very important provider of behavioral health services, we wanted to capture that as well. So while yes, you are correct, is those services are paid technically as T1015 services, you know, we want to understand it as much as possible. And so that's why we broke it out separately.
And the only thing I would add to that, Sharon, is that because the 224s break out, you know, behavioral health separately from medical, having behavioral health on its own tab, you know, helps make sure everything ties out to the 224. But yes, to David's point about dental, obviously that's not broken out separately on the 224. But yeah, that memo that we received from MPCA about concerns that the recent Section 25 increases weren't benefiting FQHCs, and that memo was, you know, there wasn't an explicit request in it about, you know, do X or do Y or do Z. It was just sort of making the general point that if other dental providers were getting an increase, you know, and it wasn't being and that benefit wasn't being extended to FQHCs, we thought it would be useful to get separate dental data on this tab, which could help inform options that might be appropriate.
Okay, Sean, why don't you?
And thank you. That question was a fantastic segue into the dental tab. And these, like we said, are subsections. Just asking some very simple questions. Do you provide dental services? And the behavioral health and other Medicare excluded tabs without loss of generality are very similar to this tab. Do you provide the services? Gross charges and units can actually be rolled up from the gross charges tab, so you don't need to make any additional calculations. But if you know your costs associated with that particular service, we want to get an idea of, we want to know what those costs are in the case that you, so there are options to the state on how to reimburse that. And then just some questions on planned expansion of that particular service line, whether it be dental, behavioral health, or other things that are not included in Medicare but are under the T1015.
Great. Thank you, Sean. I think that's the last tab. Holly, if we can flip back to the main deck. So that's really the bulk of our, in fact, that is our formal presentation, you know, which is to make sure you understand who we are, why we're doing this, how we're going to do this, and then what we're going to do in terms of collecting the information. You know, and we, as Holly said at the onset, we kept our formal presentation relatively tight because now we have an opportunity to hear more from you. We've already had some great questions. Thank you very much. But we want to continue to hear from them. And just to sort of emphasize, you know, Peter's point is there is a sort of a balance between sort of the goals of the FQHCs and, quite frankly, the language of the statute or the legislation, which we do have to adhere to. So we, you know, we will be finding that balance in conjunction with the state, but that is sort of the overriding governing piece of language. So at this juncture, I will open the floor to discussion or questions. And as I say, and Holly, if you want to flip to the page that has sort of our contact information, just to put that up there so people can take a chance to write that down. So as you can see, that's me. By all means, you can reach out to me and ask questions. You know, what I will say is in terms of procedure, what we'll do is we'll collect questions and then we will convey those questions back to the entire group with an answer, right? So whether it's, even if you ask a one-on-one question, we will repeat the question back to the entire group along with the response. So so what we will do is if I get a question from you, I will acknowledge the receipt of that question, but the response, I may wait a little bit of time just to gather questions so that we can periodically put out a group of questions to the entire body and the answer, so everybody knows what everyone said. And that will also apply today. I mean, if for some reason you all ask a question that, you know, we don't have an immediate answer for, we'll take it back. We will include that in our list of questions and then answers getting back to the entire group. So don't be concerned if we aren't able to answer something today or aren't able to answer something immediately that you write in. We will provide a response, and those responses and questions will be available to the entire group. It's not going to be, oh, someone asked a question and got an answer. So that way it also prevents, you know, questions being repeated. So with that, please, you know, take a moment, write down, you know, capture this information. And Peter, are we going to post this presentation on your website?
Yes.
Peter, I think.
Okay. So it will have my contact information.
And I wanted to emphasize something that David said. So we will be taking those questions back and providing them to everybody, but we won't be calling out FQHCs. So don't feel like your name is going to be attached to that question.
Right.
Yeah, this is not a process to call anybody out for a question asked. This is really just in transparency. You know, if one FQHC has a question, it will probably apply to everybody. So we just want to make sure we share all that information with everyone. But you are absolutely, you know, we're not calling you out by publishing those questions, and just to make sure you know your name's not going to be attached to it.
Thanks, Holly. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true.
And David, we've got a question in chat from Craig. Will we have access to the slides and worksheets that were shown on the webinar?
So as Peter said, this presentation will be posted to the website. The actual the details of that cost report is actually going to be deployed, right? So I think as was said at the top by Holly at the top of the presentation, the process is going to be, we've got this draft supplemental cost report. We're going to hear from you today. We'll, you know, hear from you sort of during the course of this week, quite frankly, because we are on a specific timeline, recalling the timeline that Holly put up. Our goal, quite frankly, is to deploy this cost report by the end of the month. right? So if we deploy this cost report by the end of the month, and so then you have the month of November to fill it out, and then we have December and early January to develop the rates. But we want to give you the time necessary, but at the same time, we do have to ask that folks stay on a pretty aggressive schedule in providing this information, bearing in mind that the initial submissions, as Holly pointed out, we may have questions that we come back to you. So, the faster you turn these around, the faster we'll get back to you. But as we said, each of you is receiving an individual rate. So, we'll just keep moving forward on everyone we have information on. Peter, looks like you're.
Yeah, can we put up that timing slide?
Yep.
Because I think that'll really help folks. And yeah, I mean, we're actually building our website this week, and so we won't have things up until the end of the week. I'm thinking, I can't think of any reason we couldn't just forward this PDF. I mean, to everybody that's on the call, because if you have comments on the format and content of the cost report, the sooner we get those comments back from you, the better, because as David mentioned, we want to deploy it no later than the end of the month in order to maintain the schedule. And Sharon, to the point that you made about, when we had that blank space at the bottom, about all of the codes that are billed under the T1015 and that pay at zero. And then David or somebody mentioned that we were going to pre-populate that before we send it out. Here's how we're going to do that. We're just going to do a DSS run, and Sharon will know what that means because she used to work here, but it's a claims run where we will be able to identify every code that was performed, every E&M. And so we're just going to create a single uniform list of every E&M code. And we're just going to paste the exact, that was billed by any FQHC, and on all the cost report templates, we're just going to paste the same thing. And then everybody can plug in, the charges and the number of visits for each of those. Now, the reason we're doing that, because, you could say, oh, that's overkill, what do you need it for? Is, again, it will help to tie things out to the 224s, because the 224, has all those different categories of services. There's the ones that show up, in the MaineCare reimbursable expenses, which of course are broken up into behavioral health and medical. Then you have the section on the 224 under that, where it goes into Medicare and non-reimbursable. And then it goes into, chiropractic and podiatry and blah, blah, blah. And so basically, having all those codes that pay at zero, having the counts included, again, just make sure that everything ties out to the 224, which and what that does is it just makes sure that we're all on the same page, that what we're basing the costs on is the correct data, and we're all on the same page about it.
Can I ask a question about the cost report? Will there be essentially one for each year, or are you going to just have additional tabs that say gross cost, dental behavioral for 18, gross dental behavioral for 19?
We'll separate the years, right? Because the 224 is separate, we will definitely separate the years.
But all in one spreadsheet?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I mean, you will get one submission, one document that you can fill out. But yes, we will definitely separate the years, because as we've been saying and Peter has been emphasizing, is the goal is to align this with the 224, so that we can make sure that we have a complete picture of your services. The other thing I just want to touch upon before we continue on with questions is, as you can see here, we've put up sort of our work timeline through January, but because I want to sort of stretch that out a little bit, which we don't have on the slide here, a little bit to the right, if you will. If you think about it, these rates, the goal is to make them effective 3/1 of 23. So working backwards from there, In other words, and for those of you who have some experience actually at the state or just long time experience with the provider, the things that have to happen for the rates to start paying on 3/1 are a number of things, which means our rates have to be done long before that period in order for them to be not only loaded into the state's MMIS system, but also there is, doing the state plan amendment, doing all the various regulatory components. So sometimes folks will say, well, gee whiz, you have a lot more time, given that we're sitting here on October 17th before March 1st. And we do have a decent amount of time, but there's things that's not on this schedule by design, not on this time frame, that they will continue on after we set the rate. So that's, to offer a transparent explanation is why why we're working on the pace and timeline we are. It's because even when we're done to make that, to get you your rates on 3/1, you have to work backwards from that date.
So if I could, I wanted to follow up on the conversation about this first step in the timeline, the incorporation of feedback, and Craig's question earlier about access to the worksheets. I mean, I think what I heard you say, Peter, was providing you could provide the PDF of this presentation this morning, but it didn't seem to me that you could see from the PDF all the elements of the draft cost report. And I would think that the health centers and Sharon and Craig would want to be able to look at the whole Excel document. Is that something that you can share in its current draft form with them so that they can give you feedback on how it's designed and so on?
Yep, that seems totally reasonable, Charlie.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, so we'll try to get the PDF and the Excel document out by the end of the day today. That's what we'll aim for. Whether that's possible by the end of the day today, I don't know, but certainly I would think by the end of the day tomorrow.
Absolutely.
All got other things we're working on too.
Yeah.
But no, thanks for bringing that up, Charlie.
Thank you.
Other thoughts, other comments, questions, perhaps to the extent, I've heard folks and we're well aware comment on the high cost of labor right now, but I'm wondering if folks would just comment anecdotally on the availability. In other words, I understand costs are one thing, but are you able to staff? And the reason I ask is it providing, if you're not, is it limiting the services you're able to provide? Just sort of, and this is just anecdotally for me, just to understand what you're up against at the moment. If you all could, or any of you could comment on that.
I think health centers are probably the best to comment, but this is Sharon. I think that all could do more recruitment if they had the funding to do it. There's just a demand for really high wages from service professionals, and it's not currently in health centers' budget to be able to pay some of the amount that's being requested. And a lot of it is not just even salary amount, it's paid time off, right? But that means you need more providers, right? If you're going to have people working shortened schedules and that sort of thing. But health centers are probably better to answer that than myself.
This is Cam Garrett from Islands Community Medical Service, and I say yes. It's a double-edged sword. What Sharon is saying, people are demanding more and more money, and you can't keep pace. I've had 3 resignations from staff for outrageous sort of salary demands, and that's even in the face of giving a 4% COLA. And then recruiting is hard, particularly in mental health and dentistry. So my situation may be a little bit unique because it's hard to hire for an island, but those 2 areas are particularly difficult, hygienist especially. And on a curious note, we found recruiting for higher level medical staff is easier since COVID, because we offer an opportunity to practice medicine in kind of a old-fashioned way, if you will, but more time with the family, putting family back in family practice. So that's been interesting.
And when you say higher level, do you mean sort of MD, PA, NP?
Yeah, FMP, PA, MD.
And I presume clinic in the behavioral health space, would that be, clinical social worker, or is it actually MD psychiatrist or psychologist?
No, clinical social worker, mostly LCSWs. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. And now, just sort of following up on the point you made earlier, with the high pay, we're just going to sort of put a box around that for a moment and say, were that, that pay available? Is staff of it? Are there people out there to be hired at the going rate, or is it even, I will say in some states we've experienced a situation where there's no amount of money I could pay because there's nobody there. They're not, or at least beyond a point that is just even economically reasonable. And I'm not talking about sort of, sort of increases. Folks would say there is no one to hire, and it's especially at the sort of medical assistant and sort of LPN, RN level.
This is Ellen from Eastport Healthcare. We're in Washington County, Maine. We have experienced an increase in applicants, but the wages are just going through the roof, and the loan repayment needs, and there's just all kinds of issues. So we are experiencing increased applicants, but they're unavailable to us because of the wages of both the clinical support team members, even the front office people. It's the wages and the wage requests are going through the roof. They're not attainable at all levels, really. So we're trying to function with current staffing levels, increased demand, and I agree with Cam. We've also had four of our 6 primary care providers cut back in their schedule, but we haven't been able to fill in because of the inability to meet the salary requirements. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Ellen. And may I just sort of follow up a little bit on that question? For the folks who are experiencing resignations due to sort of, staff feeling that the salaries are inadequate, are you losing out to other types of providers, or are these people just sort of leaving the market?
David, I think generally people are being lost to hospital systems.
Okay.
Who can pay more, and very often it's critical access hospitals, which are getting reimbursed 110% of their cost every year. So if they pay them more, they're going to get the cost back. The other place that I'm hearing anyway that people are going to is they're leaving their job and they're becoming a traveling provider.
Yes.
But providing in the same area. Right, they're leaving their job and taking a much higher pay through a traveling organization that then contracts with the place they left.
Do a number of your organizations hire, or are they put in a position where they need to hire travelers?
I don't know if any of our FQHCs hire travelers or per diems or not.
Okay.
I'm just hearing that across the state from people.
Okay. Thank you. That this is extremely beneficial.
It's the hospitals who are hiring travelers.
Got it.
And the other for-profit agencies. It's not the health centers we can't afford the traveler wage.
Right. I understand.
This is Anne from Greater Portland Health in Portland. I just wanted to say the same thing about the wages that people are asking for. So there is a shortage of dental hygienists. I'll just use them as an example, but we have had multiple applicants, but we cannot compete with the salaries that they're being offered by private dental organizations. And
we're seeing the ask at like $10, $12 more than it was a year ago. And so one of the thing is I only speak for us, we could provide more access and there is a need and a demand for it, but we can't afford the salary and benefits based on the program revenue that we would bring in. So you're balancing, yes, there's a need in your community, but at those rates, we don't make, with our uninsured rate, we don't make enough money to be able to cover it. And FQHC grant funding is just one small portion of the budget, right? We rely very heavily on program revenue.
Right. Thank you for that. Other questions or comments?
So this is Craig again. First of all, I've really appreciated this conversation. This has been a very collaborative discussion, and I've just been writing down some key points I think we're going to be dealing with and making sure I'm hearing this right. So obviously we have the legislation that we have to abide by, which talks about 2018, 2019 fiscal years. But then we also have the next issue of trying to inflate the cost to the current circumstances. We've talked a lot about what those circumstances are, and maybe need to look at a change in scope or some kind of process to update those rates, which will be beneficial going forward anyway. And then the last thing to think about is, or that I heard was, and then we want to project forward to anticipate what the trends will be, right? And to try to make sure that the rates are keeping close to costs. But I did want to point out in the legislation, it does allow for rebasing in future years. So that may need to be part of the conversation. We're in such a weird time right now that we're going to try to get it right, but we may want to think about what's a future date to check the rates and make sure that, what we projected actually happened in the market.
That's actually an excellent point. I think, and that's something I touched on earlier is, if you were to look at sort of where you were in 19 and where you are today, that's probably a fairly steep slope as it pertains to staff salaries. But we don't believe currently that, that's going to continue on indefinitely. And so the question is when does it's not, and it's highly unlikely that it's going to tip down again. I think, you are looking at something like a new normal, although there might be a slight, but when does it level out? Right? When does that become sort of a constant and we go back to sort of what would be considered typical inflation when inflation itself returns to something more standard? I mean, as you know, we're facing these days 8% plus inflation, but there will be a point when we will return to something more of a historic steady state. I mean, looking back at the data over many years going back, even decades, we do see that inflation does return to something more akin to lower single digits. And so at what point does that happen? And more importantly, when does it happen? So you raise an excellent point, Craig, about that as to how do you, keep your finger on that pulse. So not only, are we compliant with this piece of legislation in BIPA, i.e. paying reasonable costs, but that the state is not, is also has a sense and is able to manage and budget for the costs. So it's a challenging time, but we hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, and one thing to add to that is we were talking about that the legislation allows for rebasing in the future. That is something we've started looking at. And that relates back to what Peter was talking about the state plan amendment. So according to CMS regulations, any changes in the alternative payment method and doing this process, we will have to open the state plan. And there are states that have put into the state plan the ability to rebase in the future. And so those are the kind of the kind of feedback that's really important because as we go through this process and start to look at what that amended state plan should include, those are the kind of things we'd want to include in it. So thank you.
Thanks, Holly.
And then Craig, on the change in scope part, the statute is pretty clear on when we do the rebasing, how we're supposed to account for any changes in scope that have occurred between 2019 and the present. But, per meetings that we had with you guys over the past year or two regarding the update we made to Section 31 back in 2016. You know, when we've all talked about how the goal of the 2016 changes was to provide greater clarity about how change in scope works than we had prior to 2016, but it's still remained confusing and imperfect. The change in scope process that's in Section 31 right now. So since we're obviously going to be doing a SPA and a rulemaking for the rebasing, we do also want to use this opportunity to work with you to improve the change in scope process going forward. Because yeah, it's confusing now. And so the fact that we're opening the SPA and the rule for the rebasing gives us the perfect opportunity to you know, to work with you guys to improve the change in scope process moving forward, so we're all on the same page about how it's supposed to work.
Peter, to that point, I think David was alluding to this before, that this is part of the process that's not explicit on the timeline that you guys have shown us. What is your thought about the timing of the SPA and how this intersects with like the implementation of the new APM, as well as some of this other conversation that's really important to future rate setting with FQHCs?
Great question, Darcy. I am going to, let's see if Kristen is still on, Kristen Merrill, who some of you know well. Let's see, in this meeting.
I am, Peter. I'm here.
Oh, so I'm going to punt that question to Kristen, but to the first point, Darcy, just about, hey, we do need to come up with, so SPA and rulemaking notwithstanding, we do need to build into our work plan the plan to engage with you on you know, deliberations about the change in scope improvement. That's sort of a separate train track going alongside this train track, and we do need to map that out. So thanks, Darcy. And yeah, on the question of SPA and rulemaking timing, I punt to Kristen.
Thanks, Peter. So in terms of the state plan process, that is going to take priority over the rulemaking process, because obviously we have to seek federal authority in order to gain any sort of FMAP. So that process will initiate immediately upon calculation of that APM rate. So once we have those final numbers, we'll start our noticing process in order to have that state plan amendment submitted and hopefully approved prior to that 3/1 implementation date. Now, in terms of the rulemaking process, we don't have a solidified timeline quite yet, because as I'm sure you all are aware, the department is going through a number of rate reform efforts for several sections of policy. So it is an ongoing process to try to define those priorities. And so we haven't quite fit this into that mold yet in a form that is finalized enough that we'd be able to share, unfortunately. But as soon as we know, we will definitely share.
So Kristen, a follow-up to that, if I might, do you have a high level of confidence, or has your experience suggested that, let's say in an ideal situation, the APM rates by mid-January are complete or as close to complete as we think they are, and that is part of the work to get the CMS approval? Is there any scenario where there might be a delay that actually pushes back the March 1 shift in the FQHC rates? Because I think that has been a concern that I've heard repeatedly, that there could be some timeline issues that push that back. And I know that you guys are working on what seems like a pretty straightforward process, but CMS is outside of your control, obviously. So I'm just curious in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. We've definitely discussed it. At this point, given the timeline that we have, we're hopeful that we can gain that approval. The current administration in CMS is, very engaged. And so obviously I'm not 100% sure, because as you said, we don't really have the control over the CMS involvement, but I'm pretty comfortable saying that I think we can gain that approval by 3/1, if not be very close to it.
So operationally, though, if that weren't to happen for some reason, that means that those rates, even if they're final, quote unquote, are not going to be live in your system until you get the green light from CMS. I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page relative to how that process works.
Question heard. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm the appropriate person to answer that. I think that's a question that we would have to kick to the MaineCare director. Just given the fact that we are talking about both state and federal funding, I think she would need to be involved in that conversation.
Okay, that's helpful to know. Thank you.
But yeah, as Kristen said, I love the phrase cautiously optimistic. Whoever coined that phrase, it's a shame they didn't copyright it. It's such a good phrase. But yeah, cautiously optimistic, Darcy.
Thank you.
Others? We have 13 minutes. And to be clear, if after we conclude this session, you say, darn, why didn't I ask David that? By all means, as I said before, you absolutely send us a question. We'll respond, or it doesn't have to be a question. It can be a thought. It can be an idea, right? I mean, this is a transparent partnership that we are establishing here. And then there will be subsequent meetings too. This is just our kickoff meeting. Although they're not on the books yet, there was going to be subsequent meetings with this group as we proceed along the process. So, all are welcome. Well, I think, Peter, that probably is sort of everyone else. Wait a minute, did I hear?
Oh, that was just me.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so next steps, we will get the and the Excel document out to you today or tomorrow. We're looking, I guess we will let's pick a deadline by which we need comments, if any. What do we think, so that we can put that in?
I mean, I'd like to hear your feedback by the end of this week. Looking at the calendar now, we sit at the 17th. We really would like to deploy this. November 1st is a Tuesday. That's 2 weeks away. We'd like to beat that date if we can, just to give you the time. I mean, but we want to keep hearing from you. So let's set the initial feedback time of Friday the 21st. Assuming we get this out to you, which we will, and then we will, as Sean mentioned, we're going to have an instruction period. So when we send this out, I think what our plan to do is either schedule a meeting, although scheduling can be challenging. We might just include a video webinar with instruction. In addition to written instructions, we will actually have a walkthrough that we'll record, and then we'll include that also, so you can have us as many times as you want. You can listen to it. So I think that will be our goal, given that everyone's schedules are very busy, and I don't want to say that we can, we'll be able to have another meeting 2 weeks from now, but we will, have instructions, and then throughout the period that you have the cost report in your hands, again, the same rules apply. You can reach out, you can ask questions. And we'll get back as quickly as we can, given our request for you to be timely. So
this is Ellen from Eastport. I just want to make sure one more time that I have quick access to this presentation and slides. Darcy, would it be possible to get these emailed out to the health centers right away so that I can share it internally?
Yeah, I think Peter was suggesting that in the next 24 hours, give or take, we should have the slide deck as well as the template. And then once I have those, I can send them out to everyone, and you guys can decide how to forward them within your individual health centers.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Darcy, would you prefer that we only send them to MPCA? I mean, I had been thinking we would just reply all to this meeting invite so that everybody who was on the invitation would get it. But either way is fine with us, whichever you think makes more sense.
I think, Peter, if you could send them to me, then I can also include some of these important feedback dates. Like, for example, you guys are looking for feedback on the template by a date certain. I can include David's email. I can kind of tee it all up So I think that that would probably be helpful in terms of messaging.
Sounds good. That's what we'll do. Okay.
I
So
think that's it.
unless anybody has anything else, we all get 8.5 minutes back into our day.
And again, I want to thank everyone for who was on the call today. Thank you for the questions you asked and for the questions you will ask. We look forward to working with you over the next several months. And you know, we really are excited about moving through this process.
Thank you all. I appreciate the time that you spent walking through this with us.
Our pleasure.
Bye-bye,
And with
everybody.
that, we'll say
Thanks,
goodbye.
everyone.